Once upon a time, there was a puppy. Just a regular old puppy. She was born in a litter of 8. Yellow lab, just like you, you know? Yeah, she was just like you. Or when you were a puppy, I imagine. I didn't know you when you were a puppy, so I can't say for sure. Maybe you were a dragon that got turned into a dog, for all I know. Anyways, this puppy, she started as a puppy, for sure. That's how the story begins. And she was waiting with her siblings to one day find her own home. And her siblings, they were adopted one by one. First her one sister, then a brother, then another sister. And eventually, it was just her. She was the only one left. And this made her a bit upset. She was lonely, she didn't have her siblings anymore. And the poor baby, she was the last one remaining. But then, this guy showed up. He was a strange fellow, very strange. He wore a top hat, but then you'd think because he wore a top hat he'd be all fancy. But you'd be wrong, because actually his pants and his shirt and coat and everything he wore, it was covered in patches, despite his fancy top hat. He was a fascinating mix in terms of appearance. For example, he had a mustache, and it was very well groomed, but the hair on his head was a completely shaggy mess. No one knew exactly what to make of him, particularly the lady who had raised the little puppy since she was born. But this fellow, he wanted a dog, so she decided she'd give him a chance. She let him in, and he met the puppy. And he spoke to the puppy in a way that the people who had adopted her siblings had not. He spoke to her as though she was on his same level, as though she had the same level of intelligence, as though... Why are you eating my foot? As though she was a person, essentially. Now, the puppy found this fascinating and strange, but also exciting and new, and quite liked to be spoken in that way, rather than spoken down to, as you doggies usually get. So, she was very friendly with this fellow. And this fellow, he was friendly right back. They were actually quite fond of each other from the get-go. Seemed like a match made in heaven, or whatever. So the lady, well, she couldn't say no. It was the perfect match. So this odd fellow with his patches and top hat, he brought home the puppy. And at first, things were bizarrely normal for how he looked and how he acted. But then, she started noticing things that did not line up with her experience of the world, things that didn't make sense. For one thing, whenever he had his tea in the morning, he didn't heat it up. It was always hot, but he didn't heat it up. And she couldn't make sense of how this could be. For another thing, the fellow sometimes just disappeared from the home, but not through the front door. And sometimes he'd come back through the front door, but more often than not, he'd just appear back in the house again, as though he were teleporting or going through a portal. Not that she understood these things, but she had no explanation for where he could be. You're so cute, Holly, baby. You're so cute. Came to the conclusion, this little puppy, with as many being as smart as she did, that this fellow that had adopted her was a wizard. Now, the thing about wizards is they can't tell you that they're a wizard, but if you know they're a wizard, and if you ask them, well, they gotta tell you. Or, well, they don't have to, but it's general courtesy. So, the puppy, in her little yappy voice, she was like, "Are you a wizard?" And the fellow, well, surprisingly, he understood, indicating that he was definitely a wizard. And he was like, And he told her that yes. And he also told her that he had definitely picked the right puppy, because to realize as quickly as she did, she must be awfully intelligent. And he rather wanted an intelligent companion. So, because the puppy now knew he was a wizard, she could join him on all his adventures. They went all across the globe, and things were very exciting. But there was one thing she didn't realize. As fast as she had realized that he was a wizard, there was another detail that was a secret that she did not quite get the hang of. She didn't quite figure out. It was quite a surprise when it happened, when the fellows showed up at the door, dressed in fancy garb, royal or military or something, not anything like she'd seen, covered in gold and decorations. Their uniforms were beautiful, extravagant. And her little wizard companion, he looked at them for a second, disappointed maybe, and he agreed that he would go with them. At first, she thought he must have been arrested. After all, why would such fancy people show up, and he would disappointingly go with them? But then she got to go with him, something she didn't expect if he was going to prison. Why he would go to prison, she wasn't sure, but they did get into quite the shenanigans at times, so she had ideas. So she went with her person. They drove in a fancy car, and then they got on a fancy boat. It was all very fancy. Not wizardy exactly, but fancy. And then they ended up on this island. And suddenly, the amount of magic she'd seen from her companion seemed like nothing. Suddenly, there was magic all around her. It was wild. It was incredible. It was overwhelming. She hid between her person's legs, and he assured her that it was all fine, that she would not come into any harm at any point in her life, as long as he was watching over her, and he always would, so long as he lived. And he reassured her that she would get used to it, that it would be fine, that she would be fine. And she believed him. She trusted him. And she continued on, and they went through the island, going through the cities in a royal carriage, and at this point she was realizing that they were not going to prison, or at least not something that was technically a prison. When they arrived at the palace, people bowed, and that is when she realized what was truly going on, that her funny little wizard companion was in fact the prince, that he had been called back to his kingdom. Yeah, you're wagging, you're excited they're going back to their kingdom. His father, unfortunately, was unwell, and his older brother had died in some magical incident, as often happens with wizards, particularly those that are royal, as they have higher quantities of magic in their blood, and higher quantities of magic can be unpredictable, unfortunately. So it was up to him to lead the kingdom, and he needed to be prepared. So they prepared him, and the little puppy, who was now a full-grown dog, she wasn't sure what to make of this. She was worried he wouldn't have time for her anymore. She was worried that their life together would be coming to an end. But despite all of the training, he did not forget her. She was always by his side. And he always played with her and cuddled her. And it was good. Even when his father died, even when he was grieving, he found comfort in her. He did not forget her. when he became king, his first royal act was to declare his lovely dog as the queen of the dogs. It hadn't been a title before that existed, but he figured that just because it didn't exist didn't mean it shouldn't. After all, his puppy, his dog, she was so clever. She could surely rule the dogs with beautiful benevolence. She wasn't sure about the role at first, but she found herself in it. She found a passion for helping the other dogs of the world, for being an in-between between dogs and people, making sure every dog is well loved, well cared for. And eventually, as always happens, this wizard king and his lovely companion, they would leave this world. But with all the good they did, they went to the stars. They became constellations that we can look up at today. And you can remember what the queen of the dogs did. You might not care so much for what her companion did, being that he was more concerned with human affairs. But he did good as well. They did good together, and we remember them for that.